Yeah, so this is just going to be me commenting about identity politics within some psychological topics and themes. Uh, Another way of sort of casting or framing what is going on in culture in terms of the normalization of this, what I generally think of as a fascistic culture, or a culture that's premised in fascistic values and sort of strange kinds of emotional groupthink that gets substituted for reason and sort of clear thinking or any kind of common sense. Um, what it really is the kind of normalization of a very sort of particular kind of subversion or sort of sadistically edged um, sort of gaslighting that that in some sense the premise of I think sort of Nazi philosophy and any kind of fascistic culture is that you have this kind of sacred psychopath, sort of in the identified as the identity itself, this kind of collective entity of this, let's say, wounded collective pride or something like that. Um, and it has a seat at the table. Everyone must respect that the psychopath has a seat at the table in terms of the cultural discourse and the just accepting that kind of, let's say, this is a conceptual metaphor or analogy, just accepting, allowing that kind of toxic pride to take a seat at the table of whatever discussion is going on is itself a fundamental um, insult and undercutting of the dignity of everyone else who sits at the table. That there's this natural hierarchy around the psychopathic um, conceptualization of some collective identity, or the collective entity is actually the chairman of the discussion, that everything revolves around the relativism of that psychopathic entity, and therefore all people have to do in discussion, or in terms of actual interactions in culture, is they have to signal that they are on the side of this psychopathic force, and everyone else has to bend the knee. And it's ironic because the kind of sadistically edged extraction that's going on, the kind of gaslighting and relativism and reframing of reality that's going on, justifies itself in terms of its own rationale in the fact that something has done that to it, that something else has, that it has been gaslit, and it is just kind of trying to fight fire with fire, although it doesn't even, I mean, in some sense, that's the fundamental dishonesty of its whole project, is that it's not even honest that it's sort of fighting fire with fire, because it's like, no, no, no. Um, this is the only way to rehabilitate the system. This is the only way to kind of to fix the narrative. It weirdly is always talking on behalf of the collective narrative. It doesn't actually participate on an even keel like anybody else. So it's sort of like, well, so in some sense, the what it's up against is not only something that has gaslit it, but something that is fundamentally, it's a conspiracy theory. It's a very deep social paranoia. It's a very deep, claim about a conspiracy. And that conspiracy has, sort of been mixed into the fundamental framing of even the languages itself, which is why they have to kind of relativistically, unilaterally grab the language and take control of it and take control of things using that unilateral aim, is because the language as it stands is fundamentally not fit for purpose, because it is part of their conspiracy theory, which is what justifies them needing to to apply this kind of ad hoc, no, that's what things really mean, as a way to kind of undercut what any kind of a discourse or engagement where they have to, so they'll never treat anyone else as having the same basic integrity or dignity, because them having a kind of inherited systemic oppression, they're on a different level of moral emergency, of a kind of there are weird sort of theories around epistemic injustice, which is one of the stupidest things that you can ever, because if there has been damage to the truth, why do you think that you can take compensation for it in the realm of pure power? Why do you think that you can, how would you imagine that you could ever be compensated for the truth that has been damaged? Because they're not actually talking about the rehabilitation of the truth. They're not talking about having epistemic justice. They're talking about essentially asserting a unilateral relativistic chairmanship of the culture. That sort of something like, well, now it's our turn, and that's the only way to reach some kind of hypothetical equilibrium point in the narrative. So it's always talking on behalf of the narrative. So you've got these sort of psychopaths wanting to talk on behalf of the narrative and to manage the narrative and mediate over it, somehow also messing up the relativism sort of paradox, like where are they sitting in judgment from? How are they purveying the system, while they talk from beyond the system, from some kind of collective sociological narrative? I do think that in some sense there is something fundamentally poisonous about the sociological framework, at least as it's sort of been developed in such an uncritical way, in such a morally inept, and there has been no sophisticated development of a kind of moral values and principles in terms of reframing sociology so that it's not a poisonous, because just the pure kind of statistical, anyway, I don't want to go down that tangent, but and you can see very much now how culture itself is starting to be bent. The feminist movies and the feminist plots and the identity politics movies and the identity politics plots in narrative, in media, and how it's lowered the quality of all these things, because essentially they have to make it about a kind of a psychopathic, self-righteous, they have to create propaganda that's fuel for the narrative correction. I was watching Ben Shapiro reacting to a movie trailer called Karen, which is about a white female racist in suburbia called Karen, who has black neighbors, and then she kind of sort of psychopathically tries to sort of psychologically traumatize them with her racism. I don't know how, or I obviously you don't know the full plot of the movie, but it's sort of it's so surreal. It's so it's such an obvious sort of manufactured piece of cultural propaganda in order to fuel this kind of psychopathic self-righteousness, which is hinged on this conspiracy theory. It really, to me, is on par with the kind of sort of conspiracy theory, propaganda about the Jewish conspiracy theory in Weimar Germany. Because the the paranoia of around the social corruption is about the inherited systemic oppression and all those sorts of things. Although, it's interesting how Ben Shapiro also points this out, that the kind of oppression that the movie is exhibiting is not the same thing as the kind of systemic oppression that people are speaking about. The systemic oppression is meant to be people's unconscious racism. That it's sort of it's almost it's almost imperceptible by those who perpetrate it. That it's sort of because it only makes sense within the kind of the psychological relativism of people who cannot give empathy to anyone else based on a kind of collective identitarian consciousness and worldview. That that there are white ways of thinking and then there are non-white ways of thinking, rather than just individual ways of thinking. And essentially, the only justification for saying that there are white ways of thinking and non-white ways of thinking, and classifying these things, is by sociological statistics correlating to differences in some kind of outcome or some kind of anything in society, and therefore these things have real effects. And in some sense, underlining to people that yes, they have generalizations in their mind, as if that's some kind of moral crime to be aware of generalizations or to have a sense of generalizations, which, as far as this is a slightly morally touchy subject to some degree, because it does have to be thought about with a bit of sophistication in order to actually not become, let's say, a crude or vulgar sort of pedant of statistical epistemic reliabilism. That as soon as we anchor our epistemology into an external let's say symbol or something like that, that we're no longer we've incepted ourselves into a narrative. Now, I do think that essentially people are always the author of their own narrative, and they're always the author indirectly of the narrative that they have allowed themselves to be incepted into. And this is a little bit of a sophisticated topic, because people do get swept away by, let's say, prevailing groupthink, and let's say they do almost by osmosis adopt some of the uncritical or unthoughtful sentiments of those that they are surrounded by. And sometimes they're even vulnerable to adopting views and beliefs that have an ostensible sort of logic and reasonableness to them, but they're sort of they are founded on a bit of sketchy, on a false premise somewhere. But it's just sort of, it's so convenient that it fits in so well with other people's, or with a particular constellation of other beliefs and things like that, that it just sort of, it gets taken for granted, or it just sort of gets assumed to comport into a nice, sort of convenient perspective. But I would say that the way to disabuse oneself of, I guess the point is that not everyone wants to disabuse themselves of morally sketchy forms of confabulation, or let's say convenience, almost sort of a kind of self-confirmation bias, but or self-invested, a self-serving confirmation bias. Uh, you know, is to at least be aware or be mindful of, like what one's deepest values are. What are your axiomatic, sort of commitments? Um, and there is a, let's say, a basic level of absurdity in terms of, well, what do you choose to almost spiritually identify with? What is your basic constitutional axiomatic investments? We would hope that people choose things that are amenable to negotiation and persuasion and some kind of solidarity and things like that. Um, anyway, that's quite a humble epistemic constitution to sort of to have to sort of to know that your values are basically arbitrary and you've chosen them, and you can just wear them on your sleeve, and that's sort of the only defense you have, rather than, let's say, the psychopathic alternative, which is to have a kind of epistemic reliabilism where you say, well, I have this authority because this is semantic claim, this is the evidence of some objective fact, and you just use words that all the good words are just linked together and on your side automatically as you rely on them, not that you have any kind of fundamental uh, definitional commitment that actually animates them from an internal locus of control, but you just say that, oh, well, that's injustice. Never mind that I don't have a concept of what justice looks like. I just know what injustice looks like. And this is what I rely on to describe and define what the injustice is. Never mind that that's all completely invested into, um, in some sense, completely uh, committing oneself to sort of to collective entities and generalizations, and sort of crazy ideas that well, everyone must have equal outcomes, or some other such completely silly and strange sort of table thumped conjecture. um, and in some sense, what it has to make up for in its basic uh, grounding of its values, or the lack thereof, the lack of having grounding values, is that it has to come up with essentially a whole narrative drama about how it is the necessary response to, and in some sense, it's always projecting the problem to be the perfect inverse of what its proposed solution is, and it doesn't have to worry about grounding its values or having any kind of intellectual framework, because I mean, it was. I always find this completely ironic that fascists don't realize this about themselves. But if you look at the kind of conspiracy theories indulged in by fascists, like the Jewish conspiracy theory, what did they say about the Jews? They talked about banking, they talked about infiltrating culture and controlling people's minds and all these sorts of things. These, I mean, if you look at how the German system made its money. I mean, the Germans invented fiat currency. The Germans, in terms of uh, the Nazi culture, was completely controlling of people's minds. You know, that everything that they complain about in their conspiracy theory is exactly what they perpetrate. It's so crazy, you know, and because in some sense, their solution is uh, is the answer uh, to a problem uh, that is just performing the exact same thing that their solution performs. You know, it's just supposedly pertaining to a different, uh, a necessary psychopathic sort of defense. You know, a necessary psychopathic, a righteous psychopathic reaction. And you know, because it's sort of it's framed within its own mentality as a defense, they can therefore take extra special measures to chair the discourse, to relativistically control the 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 outcome of the exchange, if there even is going to be an exchange or a discourse. That's why they're capable of toying with the semantics as well as toying with uh, the sociological, statistical evidence, you know, that gets cherry picked in order to comport to their narrative. Um, and you know, all of this is very problematic in terms of how you actually deal with these sorts of people, because I don't think that you can actually rescue many of these people. I think that they are morally so inept and vacuous that they have essentially already sold their souls to an epistemic um, reliabilism. And they have already, let's say, culturally or sociologically entrained themselves to having a kind of, in some sense, there's something fundamentally parasitic about their mentality. They will have to continually be on the right side of history in how they promulgate a kind of partisan politics, which has to be invested in the other side's fundamental moral deficit, or something like that. So it's like a kind of moral vampirism where they have to have a scapegoat, an ideological scapegoat, in order to sustain their sense of self-esteem in terms of their own right thinking within their uh, uh, you know, because they don't have a way of even reasoning their own position. It's not a reasoning position. It's based on sociological, statistical, cherry-picked narrative descriptions that are essentially being described on behalf of a group of people, on behalf of a whole faction, on behalf of a collective entity. So they're always speaking on behalf of a group lived experience. So, like, there is no fundamental discourse with that. You can't actually renegotiate that. You have to say, no, you're looking at this from a fundamentally dishonest, from a fundamentally self, you know, you're framing this from a circular reasoning, you know, sort of apparatus that is deeply insulated in its own relativism. Um, and that, you know, you know, and to model an alternative, well, how else would you live? Oh, well, you actually have to choose your own values and choose your commitments, um, and reason from first principles as essentially as an atom rather than as a member of an identity faction is like, uh, is like getting someone to think for the first time, yeah, unplugging them from a kind of matrix, and everything that they've been told is that, well, if they unplug from the matrix, then they are then they need to be attacked by the matrix. So there's this immediate sort of they will see themselves as being essentially vulnerable to the psychopathic collective program that they were a part of. I mean, the Matrix is really the perfect metaphor for this. It really is. If you watch the first movie of the Matrix, it has this modeled in it quite perfectly. But people that aren't plugged into the Matrix, all the people around them can suddenly become an agent of the Matrix and attack those who aren't plugged in. Anyway, aren't plugged into the program. Anyway, so, not only do you have this intellectual gap to leap over and to jump over, but you also have this immediate, sort of sense of self-preservation that essentially, even if intellectually you could work out what the alternative frame of reference is, not only would you have to choose to dislocate yourself from the easy moral self-righteousness, but then you would also have to have the tolerance to expose yourself um, to the um, to the sort of to the mob, to the witch hunt, to the persecution, which then you would have to sort of guard yourself against, and so yeah, I mean, I think that is only going to happen when culture. That's only going to be possible for people to make that jump if culture does get more bifurcated, more overtly, and institutions and spaces and cultural icons, to some degree, make a make a clear fence on that this is not a place in which identity politics, because in some sense there are no institutions, I would say, and cultural spaces uh, which very clearly have institutionalized administration which has protection against identity politics, and that is a real challenge, because it's very hard then to organize one's life in a way in which that one can become that one can start to accumulate cultural victories and, let's say, amass terrain in the mind in which one can be disconnected from this psychopathic ideology. Um, which is why I think it was so important that people like Brett Weinstein perhaps should have openly supported Trump and Trump's candidacy. Um, the lack of that kind of overt endorsement, I think, was a huge missed opportunity in the things like the culture wars. But it's simply because uh, it really is strange. I mean, to me, it does seem like an anomaly. I yeah, I mean, I do chalk this up to that there are people who seemingly reject identity politics, but they don't do so for what I would consider to be a properly principled. They don't have a principled critique of it. Uh, they don't. And anyway, I've got lots of recordings where I'm railing against Brett Weinstein for his intellectual sympathy, which I think makes him quite weak at that he doesn't philosophically or from a moral perspective he doesn't kind of gets lost in the weeds of some of their sociological trickery uh, and sort of statistical aggregation and gathering and rhetoric, which I think he falls foul of. He sort of he gives a lot of that propaganda way too much play. Because let's say that the scientific pretensions of sociology are they have not been properly morally vetted with some kind of morally principled philosophy that so you've got a kind of sort of machine learn anyway that is a tangent, that is a sophisticated topic that I don't want to I've now sort of almost mentioned it twice, but it I'd have to think about that and ground my thoughts on that just to kind of I have spoken about this issue in depth in other recordings, but it is a bit of a separate topic in itself. But yeah, so the need to extricate the psychopath from the table, because even debating with the psychopath, even seemingly entering into negotiation with the psychopath, even if you want to sort of do so in a way to remove its chairmanship of the discourse, is fundamentally problematic. You can't even invite the psychopath into your dwelling. It's like inviting the vampire through the threshold. Um, Doing so already fundamentally puts you under the spell, puts you under the narrative sort of witchcraft, and you have already seeded something of because of the nature of their toxic narrative projection and all those sorts of things. Uh, I do think that it's necessary to throw them out of the institutions to create cultural spaces, but also institutional organization and things like that. That puts a sign up as to why they are not welcome. To actually say no, you need to, if you want to approach this space, if you want to engage in this space, these are the things that you have to know are not, don't pull these stunts. Don't, we don't tolerate this kind of tactical manipulation and subversion. And perhaps I should have gone into more detail as to thinking about how that can be sort of practically done. I mean, the problem is that this comes these facets are part of a worldview which, to my mind, is so fundamentally rotten and fallen that you know again it's problematic because you can't negotiate them out of it because it's a worldview. and the only way to essentially lead them out of it in any possible way is that you have to reproduce their worldview within another equally robust worldview, because they're basically totalitarian. So the only way to kind of conquer a totalitarian ideology is to reproduce that totalitarian ideology within an alternative sort of psychological rigor, an alternative psychological perspective and schema, where you show that essentially, you know, they are completely invested in an external locus of control, that everything rests on a kind of epistemic reliabilism, which they are fundamentally sort of addicted to, and because otherwise they can't create a narrative that has enough moral panic and a kind of moral hazard for not already being part of its, you know, sort of project. Because in some sense, I mean, that's one of the problems with them, is that they don't have the time to reconsider their poisonous, you know, sort of virulent aspiration for a kind of sociological plan. Um, so, you know, they're always requiring this kind of token sort of taxation that you must cede to them, that their semantic claims. You know, you must let them tokenistically, you know, sort of disrupt the meaning of words, and, you know, sort of holding the default sort of model of reality and society. Within their sort of narrative descriptions. But I mean, I do think, you know, the sociological reductionism that they are invested in, I do think is very accurately described as is basically amounting to uh, the idea that the group itself holds the source of moral consideration, that the group entity is where moral consideration is ultimately sourced and vested in. And so, you know, people are only um, making valid or viable sort of moral complaints um, in as much as that they are unfolding some necessary reconstitution and repositioning of this drama between collective identities, between um, the collective entity. And essentially, why is that necessary? Well, it's necessary because sociology gives us some empirical evidence that tells us, and we can invent a kind of sympathetic social psychology that we can just say that has impregnated within that social psychology whatever statistical things we see from our empirical sociology. So, you know, they've just got this slew of um, generalizations which they can complain about. Never mind that generalizations themselves are, you know, I mean, yes, they're caused by reasons, and we should be looking for those reasons. The problem is that they're not looking for the reason because they already have an answer. Um, and in some sense, you know, just because you have a reason for a generalization doesn't mean that necessarily it's that makes it underheal, that makes it capable of being novated or adapted or modulated or altered. I mean, some generalizations are, again, I think we do have to have a certain level of tolerance um, within, this is a technical sort of sophisticated point, but uh, that we do have to get sort of like comfortable with a kind of pragmatism that, I mean, sorry, this is a bit of a complicated point, but I mean, this is why I say that it's important that drugs should be legalized, and people that want to have abortions, that for some window you should have to have some window of a legal abortion, so that you can even have the amoral, secular, legal order is not a moral, sociological arm of enforcement, so that we can know that the sociological paradigm does not give us moral representative data. That when we find statistical generalizations, that that isn't a necessary evidence of some kind of sorry, now I've just made this argument slightly too convoluted, but is that the system itself, the sociological system, does not hold the morality, but the individual engaging in the decisions that they make in, that has to have a completely separate lens. That has to be spoken of on a different level of first principles, and deconstructed from a completely different perspective. And you can't merge the psychology of individuals and a disgusting idea of social psychology that is sociologically embedded into something that is supposedly giving you a kind of morally charged data set. That we have, from the sociological paradigm, has very horribly distorted an idea of having an internal locus of control. It's essentially, it swept it under the rug by very kind of loose thinking, by also sort of having this assumed epistemic reliabilism that's sort of baked into how sociology accounts for anything, or how it records anything. I mean, actually, I would argue that maybe sociology doesn't have to have that baked into it, but I mean, that is how sociology is utilized. That's how it's depended on, and that's how people make extractions from it in a very haphazard way, as if sociology is a field of research as meritorious or valid as, sort of as any other field. Sort of treating people as a kind of, as almost like a physical, formulaically denotated phenomena, like it's just kind of electrodynamics, or sort of entropy, or sort of some other sort of physical thing that can be modeled by algorithms and things like that. And so, I mean, my solution to this is to imagine that the data that comes out of sociology, that the generalizations which we can derive from sociology, don't have any moral legs to stand on, that you have to go investigating what's actually going on in any outcome or any statistical distribution. You have to, make a completely independent account of what's going on in terms of the reason. When you say that, well, this is the reason for this happening, that reasoning, although you can come up with generalized reasoning or rationalization around features or properties to do with groups, um, those things are never going to be true. They're always going to be a disgusting sort of reductionist fiction um, that really don't have any moral legs to stand on. And in as much as that they can be considered to be generally true, I mean, again, like, what is the moral depth or value of any such claim? I mean, we can't have government policy treating that or directly. Um, or let's say in treating that directly. I mean, you could perhaps use it as an obtuse tool to work out, well, how because you have to work out, well, what is this the symptom of, rather than saying that this is an effect that has to be treated. Let's never treat the symptom. Let's treat the actual cause, which is something that can't be. You can't use sociology to treat the cause. It's not going to happen, because in terms of sociology, that's already been baked into the data. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling a bit now, but this is the overall. I mean, this is thematically the evil sort of psychopathy that is the kind of the ideology of just sort of follow the effect rather than actually make a real account of the cause. And the problem is you can't make a real account of the cause unless you invent these disgusting moral entities of a collective identity that actually is seen as the vestige, as the source of moral consideration, that it actually is the group that holds the value, not the individual. And then you're never treating a cause, you're always treating an effect. There's an interesting intellectual parallel to this within machine learning and things like that, which is what was at the top of my mind when I was talking about the stuff, because anyway, it's not really relevant to bring that up, but machine learning has a similar kind of oversight built into it, which is, essentially that you can make something that seems to fulfill some kind of utility or function, but I would argue that machine learning can be reduced into a human understanding. And then when you realize perhaps how it's treating certain inputs obtusely, or the level of abstraction in which its mechanism is, how it's sort of substituting um, deductive obviously that's a bit of a metaphor here, but a kind of how it's substituting for it's a conceptual process that's seemingly deductive in its reasoning. Um, it's substituting with a kind of with a correlative uh, I haven't thought about this issue for a long time, but something like a correlative relational sort of necessary dependence. Uh, that it's worked out that uh, there are trees of valid um, almost like inductive reasoning solutions, um, relays of sort of necessary conditions, that in some recipe aggregation of those branches and of those necessary conditional, sort of correlations, um, are a kind of anyway. I'm just describing it slightly poorly, but that essentially that those things are kind of epistemic reliability path pathways, and obviously those pathways can have varying degrees of different relays that equivocates to the same sort of epistemic reliabilism sort of test. Uh, the only problem really with machine learning is it has sort of the same problem that Brainiac has in the Superman comic books, is that you have to believe that it understands fundamentally a description of what's going on better than anything else, and in some sense, it forces you to rely on descriptions which are fundamentally epistemic reliabilist in their character, so that they cannot be understood. Um, by, let's say, by real intelligence, and so you've got a pseudo intelligence problem. I mean, even in the phrase machine learning. Now, I mean, this is fine to use these things as instruments and tools, but what happens with people in a technical field is they well, I guess they like to put faith in what they do, and so what you end up is with a kind of cast of people who have invested a great amount of uh, utilitarian value in these instruments, and so much so that they see them as a kind of as a superior intelligence, even though these things aren't intelligent. Um, but there is a kind of virtual intelligence, or a pseudo intelligence, in that uh, you can use them to solve a problem. Um, Although that's even slightly problematic, because I would say that you never actually you never answer the question when you're using an epistemic reliabilist framework. In some sense, there is no question. It's just a kind of it's the question is translated into a test. Anyway, this is going to get so metaphysical. I don't really want to continue down this tangent, but I haven't gone through this subject matter in my mind recently, but I mean, I do have some recordings where I'm going on and on about this kind of issue. But there are you end up making conflations. You end up thinking that well, there's something defective about human intelligence, and this is actually the thing that is actually the kind of the oracle that tells you the real reality, the real truth of of a kind of, in the same way that I often think of the Brainiac in the Superman comic book series, which was this artificial intelligence which ended up destroying Krypton, and lying to the people about it. That, it's sort of like thinking, well, human beings are so stupid that we can't understand science fully, and we're just not capable of doing so. So what we really need to do is make an artificial intelligence that tells us that it does understand it, and it also can tell us that we will never understand it. And if we can just make an artificial intelligence tell us that, and then it can do the science for us from then on out, that's the kind of, that's the apex that we can hope to do, is produce something that confirms that there's a form of understanding that is just beyond human understanding, and you get this kind of misanthropic sort of self-fulfilling inclination, that I would argue is just a kind of reflection of the basic nature of epistemic reliabilism. Gets you into this motif, which I think is represented perfectly in Brainiac in the Superman comic books, and that is essentially what we are suffering from at the moment in terms of identity politics, which I would say is driven from a kind of sociology, but which is arguably it has some thematic links with machine learning, I would argue. Anyway, it's not such a useful tangent. This is an addendum. I just want to sort of go back and make a second pass at summarizing the kind of the major political theme that I was somewhat insinuating, and this is a regular theme, but perhaps it's not obvious what I was basically saying, but that something like the academic field of sociology, when combined with, let's say, statist, centralized sort of faith that the state, that a government is kind of like that, what the government is treating is not a citizen, is not an individual citizen within a secular framework of democratic liberal values, but instead what the government is tending to or addressing is a sociological analysis, or a sociological reduction of society, that it's the government's job to sort of cater to some kind of sociological algorithm, or some kind of generalizations that they have to kind of keep running. And I think that this is, perhaps it's a kind of, because we've had this problem, I've tried to describe it in many different ways, that this is why I think that what the actual way to fix this is to reinforce the legal framework and the legal structure, so that the, let's say, the fundamental ideology of how the state operates is fundamentally curtailed by a strong legal, substantive, principled bastion that stops the state from being able to treat people like just mere pawns to some sociological designed outcome, so that people can't just be put in some kind of sociological planning, because that is the true guarantee of what is originally, I mean, the phrase social justice was actually invented by Orwell, and he didn't give a definition, but I believe that this is someone who wrote 1984. This is what social justice is. It means that you're not part of some kind of, you're not some denizen in some sociological project, that that you are taken as an individual, sort of end in yourself as an individual, not an end as a cog in a group entity, in a generalization. And so there are, I mean, look, you do have, let's say, there is some role for democracies to pander to their electorate however they so wish, and to win a mandate that then they can do something with that mandate. But it has to be curtailed against some bastion of some limits of how whatever policy that they want to generate is treating the citizen. Which, I mean, in some sense, even within all the guardrails that I want properly reinforced, you still have perhaps a slide into a kind of infantilism, into a kind of sort of where you're choosing your governments to essentially sort of tend to sociological optimization, um, which might have, let's say, a kind of toxic effect on the morality of the culture. Because, as I've said, that what this essentially does is that the soft culture of a society then becomes vacuous, it becomes superfluous, it is irrelevant, uh, contrasted against the social enforcement that the state is meant to provide. So, why do you even have to have a moral compass when you just need to then know what the law, what the legal system says, what a policeman will stop you from doing becomes the only question. There's no moral conscience beyond that, because essentially everything good must be essentially installed and articulated and impelled through some kind of state uh, uh, program. In which case you've lost the liberal independence. That which is also, we see all these things under threat. You can't even have an independent um, any independent free thinking or critical thinking, is just kind of any kind of heterodoxy is fundamentally, um, we really have precipitated a kind of a political um, echo chamber that is very much like a kind of Chinese propaganda statist, kind of that culture and politics is is the same kind of ideological morality, that there's no bifurcation between having, um, there's no room for discourse. It's all a signal into this kind of authoritarian project that needs to be always unified and sort of installed into the political power. Anyway, so the kind of, as I hear myself talking, I realize how sort of how weirdly sophisticated or complicated I'm making the sound, because there is a I'm arguing on behalf of a very particular kind of mess that I want society to be in. I want society to be culturally, um, to have a proper role for culture, to be where the morality is propagated and where it matters and where it has to matter, because the state, in some sense, does not have that voice, to be the voice of a kind of a traditional or a conventional morality. That I don't want to hear politicians being paternalistic or moralizing, um, to some degree. That's not their role. I mean, they can, to be the voice. I mean, that's exactly how the Chinese system is. When the big politicians come to visit the city, then all the brothels close down, and suddenly, for 1 week, it's sort of, you clean your room because the parent is coming uh, to inspect. It's a very, you know the culture is completely insipid and facile, um, to this pageantry, to this, sort of moral play, um, where it's all superficial. And so I endorse weird things where I say, we have to tolerate parents, essentially bad parenting, essentially to some degree, so that we don't just have within certain limits, so that we don't just have a state that displaces the role of the family and the model of how to raise children, so that we actually have an independent culture, so that consent and choice and decision making matters, and that there's a certain dignity and sanctity in having a free society, which means that in some sense we have to allow children to be victims of their parents within some bounds, within because otherwise we live in a statist authoritarian, in a government led societal, sort of roller coaster. That you live in a the alternative to having a free society is that you have a runaway project, which there's no coming back from that, because then you're just the zeitgeist is taking you, and there's no room for actual diversity, for actual heterodoxy, for actual, and obviously, part of the consequences of having real heterodoxy is that you're going to have differing outcomes, and you're going to have, you can make sort of generalizations, and maybe the government, can try to work out, well, if we have these bad symptoms, what are the causes of that, and can we actually respectfully, or within the bounds of how we are procedurally on notice from the liberal order, we can try to make certain kinds of interventions. We can try to promote, education. We can try to promote skills. We can try to attend to the cause. But then we must be honest that the government is in some sense, the government never wants to do this. In some sense, it doesn't want to treat the cause, because if it treats the cause, it actually has to kind of actually confront people in some respect, because it has to say, you're actually causing this. So if we want this symptom to be different, if we want to clean up this effect, we actually have to change some behavior here, or we have to introduce some education, where that is in some sense, then they have to be honest about their pedagogy, which is a kind of slightly infantilizing thing to go through. And in some sense, it's much easier just to say, well, we'll insulate you from your own bad decisions, or we'll let you stay unconscious, and we'll just clean up the symptoms, and we'll just nanny you, and we'll chase after you, never mind the moral hazard, or the kind of dysgenic, or sort of effect that has in subsidizing poor decisions, or and creating also the possibility of a kind of a cascade failure and spiral, kind of, in terms of how you are rewarding often, essentially, you are literally creating a perverse incentive in the system, usually, when you are just treating a symptom, which is in some sense what you also have to do within the current paradigm of identity politics. You can't treat the cause, because if you do, you are being an agent of the white supremacist patriarchy. It's sort of you are promoting things that are aspects of whiteness, all this weird, strange racial conspiracy theory, sort of bullshit. And so, it's anathema for them to have common values or live in a common reality. You have to live in this relativistic reality that's being projected from these group, collective entity, lived experience, bubbles, which are uh, incapable of being of the same quality in some sense, or homogenizing into a common culture, uh, that they have to be sort of distinct tug of war power games, or something like that, because in some sense we don't share the same reality according to them. But I mean, or they would perhaps say, well, it's not them that is creating the split, it is the inherited oppression, and the ongoing suppression, which can only be combated in their weird social psychology translation of what the real problem is that people feel undermined because of the state of their collective pride. So it's sort of like you have to let them have a kind of vulnerable narcissism, because that's the only way that they can sort of protect themselves in the immediate, and then also extract resources in the medium and long term from this ideological grift, which is then always treating the symptom and not able to look at the cause, because the cause is defined by the narrative of the idea. The cause is the generalization of the fact of the identities themselves. So it is a kind of circular semantic arrangement of describing a narrative. But sorry, I shouldn't recap all this stuff, but so that, in some sense, I think, I mean, what I've just reproduced now is an example of something that has probably, this has been in politics in some form or another. I mean, it's certainly been in American politics. The Democratic Party has used this kind of logic, this kind of rationale. It's sort of, it's that's how they've pandered to the special interest groups. This is how they've treated them. So this is a kind of, as a psychological program, has been in effect on, in certain left-wing politics, so-called on the left, for quite a while, sort of leveraging a very dedicated voting bloc that's sort of fueled on a kind of vulnerable narcissism, of needing to get your own back from the system. And obviously, I mean, this is a whole diversion, and this is a diversionary form of politics in which you end up not being able to have any kind of real progressive politics in the real sense of the word, because you could actually develop government policies that dealt with causes. Obviously, it would be a lot harder work, because it would actually be pedagogical in nature, it would be educational in nature. You would actually have a halfway house, and you would get people in the halfway house, and you would deliver some process to them, and then they would graduate from that program, and then they would no longer be recipients of the program, and that would be dealing with the cause, not just delivering to them some ongoing benefits, that they wouldn't just always be a recipient of some kind of, that you would actually engender empowerment and self sufficiency and independence as the real route, as the real road that needs to actually be, as the real ladder, or and so that whole model essentially has been, politics has found a way to because in some sense, if you actually made programs like that, you would actually have a different kind, because in some sense then you would have government projects which would finish the job. They would do something, they would find out how to do it on a small scale at least, and eventually they would either process all the people that needed to be targeted, or then you would find a way to integrate that module perhaps into education at large. You would find a way to integrate what that missing piece of the puzzle. You would find a way to generalize it. You would have a module or something like that within some subject within education. So and you would raise standards, and you would actually have things functioning, and you would work out how to. But we don't have any of those. I guess I'm talking from the perspective of South Africa, but I mean, the standard of everything is sort of collapsing. The standard of education, the standard of politics, standard of just sort of common sense, the standard of journalism. All these things are sort of are fundamentally so hooked into catering to some version of sort of vulnerable narcissism, or being responsive to a kind of psychopathy that we have to make a kind of cultural tolerance of, or a kind of anyway. But so yeah, I mean, I guess I am splitting it up. I'm actually saying that there are now these cultivated psychopaths and vulnerable narcissists who have actually been engendered by this political economy, and these kinds of these the intellectual space has been seeded. They have been normalized, and now that they have actually they take on this role, this seat at the table has been waiting for them. Now that they actually perform this function, we kind of have to, in some sense, culture seems to me to be waiting for them to trigger an excuse for everyone else to throw them out the room, perhaps. I mean, it's not as if culture at large is actually waiting for them to fail so that we can move on to the next cultural epoch, so that we can actually graduate from this horrible, depressing, decrepit culture of normalized fascistic values and all the things that I say about it. But, I mean, World War II had to happen for us to get rid of these people before. And I don't think that we need to wait around for these people to start wars and to get more irrational and more insane and waste more resources. I mean, that's the biggest thing, is that this whole political diversion is a horrible sideshow. It's such a waste of energy and focus and attention. It's so it's the opposite of practical, hands-on dealing with the symptoms of things. In some sense, it makes it impossible. They make it impossible to actually make things better. They entrench a kind of waste. They always are exacerbating their narrative. The more you listen to them, the more that they're proved right, because the more of the kind of destruction that is created by the kind of intervention that they demand. Anyway, but in some sense, they have to. It's almost as if you need an excuse in order to eject these people. They need to, and they need to fail their ideology. They need to represent and fail their ideology at some point in order to actually throw it out as a model of something. Because, let's say, the simplicity of it, the kind of the automatic self-righteousness which these vulnerable narcissists or these psychopaths lend to their faction, to those who would fall within their ranks and within their general endorsement, those who would be the faithful followers of the Führer, of the savior of the identity. Führer in German means savior. That the psychopath is the savior, and so you have to wait for the savior to sort of to show himself to be an overt failure in essence, that it is in fact a false prophet, that the whole thing. And there seems to be this horrible reticence because no one seems to have the principled stance to kind of say, no, this thing is actually, in principle, it's morally corrupt. And that is why we're seeing this corruption and why everyone is so dishonest and lying about it. But because the principle, you have to do weird things like what I'm doing, and saying, well, actually, we we need to understand the nature of the thing that the state is, that the state is not the bastion of a perfect morality. It has to be the bastion of a kind of secular morality, so that we can actually keep morality alive in the culture, so that it can belong to the individual. And there is a kind of ethic that the state does have to come under the heel of. The state must be organized around a kind of ethic, but it's not the same kind of ethic as an individual's morality. Doesn't have the same, let's say, powers as an individual's morality. So yeah, I mean, the state, I think, can't be seen to act as just another individual. It's not, the state is not another individual. With a kind of legal personality. And I think that this is a necessary thing in order for the state to represent the sovereignty of the people, of the citizens. So that it doesn't come to represent the sovereignty of some kind of moral authority, that it only has the moral authority that the citizenry, that it is somewhat of a pale reflection of the sovereignty of its citizenry. And that's all it can ever hope to somewhat reflect, and therefore it has to be slightly, let's say, complicated. But yeah, the kind of simplicity in which people conceive of the state, and within which people want to relate to the state and see it as a kind of moral arbiter. In some sense, again, this is a failing that the courts have not set up these limits against the state to vindicate that there is an individual sphere, a private sphere of freedom of conscience, and that the state is actually curtailed within certain parameters, that it can't actually tread on individual rights, that when it does tread on individual rights, it has to justify them according to the limitations clause. There is no such thing as a governmental prerogative that is from an alien branch of law. That's a concept that we have somehow imported from American jurisprudence, which has a different constitutional order, one that I would be slightly critical of, but it's a lot older as well. But and it has some of its charm, but I do think that identity politics does actually deliver a kind of a bit of a fundamental challenge to the American. In some sense, it does show the chink in the armor of the American framework. But anyway, that's something that I deal with in other recordings. But just repeating my thesis that what am I? What was my? So I guess my general point that I'm talking about is how to deal with the psychopath that's sort of chairing the public discourse and that's holding the whole culture ransom. And I mean, I have basically said it. We need to have institutions that are cleansed of this kind of ideology that sort of negate the room for these kinds of psychopaths and identitarian fascists setting up shop. And essentially, I guess you have to do it one institution at a time, essentially, or you and in some sense it doesn't help that people don't want to speak up against it because they are so afraid, of having to deal with the psycho with the witch hunts and the mob seeking revenge for not bending the knee to it. But sorry, okay. There was another point that I wanted to make, which was about that sort of. I mean, this is a common thread, the theme that conservatives talk about. That essentially government cannot be essentially the one-stop shop for the human condition. It can't be the answer. It can't be the final that sort of the consent of people, that people have to work out how to get along with one another in some sense, and government can't just give you what you deserve, because in some sense it's not like a preschool teacher that's mediating some dispute, and therefore it is going to provide through some manner of redistribution. I do think that the state does have an ambit to tend to things at their cause and to try to promote the reduction of disadvantage by tending to them at their cause, but also to preserve, let's say, all the tangible rights in the South African Constitution are all framed quite sharply with the word access, that the government essentially must ensure access. And this means that there is either a role for some kind of small state holding or some kind of regulation that does make some industries beholden to some kind of some sense. This is not necessary unless you ever get riddled with monopolies or with practices within industries which make them completely opaque, or make new entry into the industry essentially into something that is a constitutionally protected, let's say, tangible anyway, there is room for the government to intervene or to create mechanisms that modulate industries so that people will always have access. Um, but in some sense, in some sense, having some kind of mechanism towards how you would generate self-empowerment in terms of like how people would um, gain access to the skills or the gain access to a market that would sell them materials so that they could actually have access to things. I mean, obviously, not everyone wants to or is in the business, but of wanting to deliver everything for themselves. But in that is one way to have a to ensure that there is always, almost on a grassroots level, that there's always access towards some kind of tangible thing. I think in general you never have to quite go that far, because all of the tangible rights that people have and which they are guaranteed access to are all things that are uh, fairly democratically um, they're already fairly democratized, essentially. None of them are things that are, I mean, a lot of the things are themselves, in some sense, natural state monopolies and are already monopolies, but which is actually causing the problem at the moment, because there's so much state corruption that those utilities themselves are essentially not capable of discharging their I mean, South Africa is effectively a failed state already. It's just it can still continue to fail even further. I mean, I guess I'm saying that more on the political side of things than on the tangible side of things. Although obviously it's deteriorating quite uh, quite starkly as well. But the depth of the failure of the political uh, this is I'm just going to be saying some despondent things now, but essentially the electorate must be held accountable for the government that it elects, otherwise you don't even live in a democracy. And so we must conclude that the electorate either is essentially has is fine with racialist politics, that they completely have normalized racialist politics, or that the ruling party is so successful with its cynical strategy of keeping people democratically illiterate, that that there are many people that vote for the ANC because they actually believe that if they don't continue to vote for the ANC, that if the ANC loses power, that there's a chance that apartheid will be reinstituted or something like that, because there's so much basic literacy in things like the Constitution being the supreme law of the land, that they don't understand the function of voting. Um, so it's sort of between those two sad states of affairs, that in some sense, the new South Africa has either not been understood, or it has been betrayed by its own electorate. And similarly, the Constitution has been betrayed by its own electorate. And I mean, obviously, there are special mentions here that the judicial officers that have created, the racialization of and the institutionalized corruption of the law, importing things like the governmental prerogative, to continue to adapt the law to the kind of things that the government wants to do in order to insulate its corruption and help disguise it within some kind of legal envelope and distorted framing. Anyway, all of these things that have been perverted. Anyway, so I mean, I see a clear road in the South African context to get things on track, but they hinge completely on principle, and they don't necessarily have a democratic or political, a natural political receptive audience with it, except for maybe that you could make a case that the Cape should succeed from the nation in order to preserve the supremacy of the Constitution, which the rest of the country is effectively happy to betray. And so we can just basically say, well, South Africa is de facto a failed state. Its electorate has de facto, either by endorsement of racialist politics, it's repudiated its own constitution, and or the ANC has doubled down in its entrenched investment into democratic illiteracy and to not developing the country so that it could get away with its corrupt politics, and it's corrupted the courts. And so therefore, with these corrupt institutions, the democracy is fundamentally it is constitutionally delinquent, and in order to preserve the supremacy of the Constitution, the Western Cape must divorce from it. It must establish its own constitutional court, because the current constitutional court is essentially not fit for purpose. It's a kind of it's a political clearinghouse, and it's created toxic jurisprudence which is fundamentally anti-constitutional, and has undermined a liberal democratic order, in order to endorse corrupt politics. And anyway, but and in some sense, we can blame the courts for not standing up, but we can also then say, well, maybe the courts are just in league with this electorate, which are also divested from these principles and these values, that they don't vote for non-racialism, or they vote for this ongoing charade. Either way, it's a toxic bundle. The courts are not going to uninstitutionally corrupt themselves, and the politicians aren't going to stop this toxic racialist rhetoric that they flirt with. And in some sense, the politicians have already, to a large extent, betrayed the Constitution irreparably, I would argue, in terms of creating the commissions that they have in order to make what I would not even call amendment to the Constitution, because the Constitution is not an act of Parliament. The Constitution is the people's document. These people have not tried to amend the people's document. They have tried to subtract from the people's document. They have tried to invent ways to negate parts of it. This is conspiracy to commit constitutional damages. These people are criminals. They have already conspired to contravene the highest law of the land, the supreme law. These people cannot be parliamentarians anymore. They are effectively criminals. They are also tantamount to basically these racialist fascists. These people, they don't believe in liberal democracy. They believe in something else. They believe in a means to an end. They believe in some kind of disgusting, never-ending corruption fiefdom, and using the disgusting consciousness of people's identity to use them as pawns in some narrative that can always scapegoat its own failings on an outgroup. Anyway, uh, so I do think this is how you deal with the psychopaths: is you have to make fences, you have to demarcate territory, and you have to claim that territory, and you have to say you're on the other side of it. And we're not saying that you have to believe in the demarcation. We believe in the demarcation, and we don't allow you entry. We bar you entry. You're not allowed here. Your presence here is unwelcome. It's against our law, our rules. You are criminals in our eyes. We have a legal system or something like that. We have institutions that that correctly label you, and our immune system is active when you're around because you are poisonous. Your moral corruption is the precursor of the state corruption, but we're not saying that you're bad because of the state corruption. We're saying that you're bad because of the moral corruption. That is the only way, I think, to actually is not wait for them to create some kind of obvious sign that they are evil fascists, and that they are going that they cause disaster in some kind of obvious way. You know, that, and this is why I say it was a missed opportunity that Weinstein did not endorse Trump, and I think he didn't do so as well for cynical reasons. But also I think that the lack of principle in that these people have, because the narrative of the psychopath has so much currency over the culture. It holds so much water. The context, the framing of reality is already so warped. Anyway.